Well, the Queen will be remembered for many things, including her overwhelming love for Corgis, of which she owned more than 30 during her reign.
A dying queen, 4 tiny dogs, and a royal family so fractured that even the most innocent creatures were dragged into the storm. That's the scandal nobody expected. Not a crown, not a throne, not a political betrayal, but 4 Corgis who quietly became collateral damage in one of the most uncomfortable royal mysteries of recent years. And the palace? Silent. Carefully silent. Because the official story sounds neat, polished, almost sentimental. But once you start looking closer, the cracks appear everywhere. A dying queen, 4 beloved dogs, and a royal family so fractured that even the most innocent creatures were caught in the crossfire. That line alone should make you pause. Because this story isn't just about pets. It's about power, optics, and the strange way royal institutions protect their image even when the details start to look uncomfortable. The public was told a gentle version of events. A grieving family honoring their queen's final wishes. A loving son stepping forward to care for the animals she adored. A touching continuation of a 70-year love story between a monarch and her dogs. But what if that version was carefully designed? What if the real sequence of events tells a very different story? To understand why this matters, you have to understand what these corgis actually meant to Queen Elizabeth II. This wasn't some royal hobby, not a decorative tradition for photographs. These dogs were woven into the rhythm of her entire life. The story began in 1944 when an 18-year-old princess received a Pembroke Welsh corgi named Susan for her birthday. One gift, one small dog. And from that moment, a royal dynasty of corgis began. Nearly every corgi the queen owned for the next 7 decades was descended from that first dog. A bloodline of loyalty stretching through wars, prime ministers, family scandals, and the longest reign in British history. But the numbers don't capture the intimacy. The queen fed them herself from silver bowls, refusing to delegate the task even when staff offered. She memorized their quirks, their moods, their favorite foods. They slept close to her rooms. They followed her through palace corridors that most people would never see. These weren't accessories to the crown. They were companions who treated her not as a monarch, but as simply the human who fed them dinner and scratched their ears in the evening. And then something happened that revealed just how much those dogs meant to her. In April 2021, when Prince Philip died, the world watched the Queen sit alone at his funeral, masked, isolated, a small figure surrounded by centuries of stone and silence. That image broke hearts everywhere. But inside Windsor Castle, behind the cameras, something else was happening. The corgis stayed with her constantly. They slept near her bed. They followed her from room to room. According to insiders, they became the emotional anchor that kept her steady through the loneliest months of her life, which makes what happened next even more unsettling. Because as the Queen's health declined in the final year of her life, she didn't leave the future of those dogs to chance. She made plans, quiet plans, specific plans. She knew her family. She knew the palace. She knew exactly how fragile loyalty could become once the cameras turned away. So arrangements were made behind closed doors. Arrangements that, according to several sources, were meant to protect the dogs from becoming symbols in royal politics. And yet the moment she died in September 2022, the story the world heard looked very different from those quiet preparations. Within days, Buckingham Palace announced that the Queen's beloved corgis would go to Prince Andrew and his former wife, Sarah Ferguson. A touching gesture, the headlines said. The son returning the dogs he had once gifted his mother. A beautiful circle of loyalty closing. But the timing raised an uncomfortable question almost immediately. Why Andrew? At that moment, he was the most controversial figure in the royal family. Stripped of titles, buried under scandal, and quietly pushed out of public royal life. And suddenly, he was entrusted with the Queen's most beloved companions. At first, everything looked picture perfect, almost suspiciously perfect. The palace had delivered its announcement, the press repeated the story, and Sarah Ferguson began posting cheerful images of the corgis running across the lawns of Royal Lodge. Happy dogs, green grass, sunshine. It was the exact visual narrative you would expect from a carefully managed royal transition. The Queen's beloved companions safe, loved, and continuing their peaceful life with family. The public moved on quickly. After all, there were bigger headlines unfolding at the time. A new king, a coming coronation, a monarchy trying to redefine itself. But beneath that polished surface, something quiet began to change. And the people who pay obsessive attention to royal details started noticing the first strange signals. The photos of the corgis slowly stopped appearing. Not gradually explained, not wrapped in a sentimental farewell post. They simply vanished from Sarah Ferguson's social media. The references disappeared. The updates stopped. Total silence. For a woman who had enthusiastically positioned herself as the devoted caretaker of the Queen's legacy, the sudden disappearance of the dogs from public view felt odd, almost deliberate, and the silence appeared at the exact moment another storm was brewing inside the royal family. King Charles pushing Prince Andrew to leave Royal Lodge, reach the massive 30-room mansion Andrew had occupied for years. What followed was an ugly internal struggle. Lawyers were involved. Financial pressure mounted. Andrew dug in and refused to leave. The once quiet residence of the Queen's beloved dogs suddenly became the center of a bitter royal property battle. Inside that house were two Corgis who had spent their entire lives in the calm routine of the Queen's carefully managed household, a routine built around stability, familiarity, and affection. Now they were living in a place wrapped in legal disputes, financial tension, and constant uncertainty. According to insiders, Andrew was often absent and Sarah Ferguson traveled frequently, leaving staff to manage the day-to-day care of the animals. If true, the reality was very different from the cheerful public narrative. And then came the moment that truly stopped royal watchers in their tracks. In October 2023, Sarah Ferguson posted a short message announcing that Sandy, one of Queen Elizabeth's beloved Corgis, had died. Just a brief goodbye. No details, no explanation, no context. The message was so vague that it immediately raised uncomfortable questions. Sandy was only about 5 years old, an age when Corgis are typically healthy and energetic. This wasn't a dog reaching the natural end of a long life. Something had happened, yet no official explanation ever emerged. The palace said nothing. Andrew said nothing. The silence was deafening. Dog experts online began asking the obvious questions. What illness or event could take the life of a young Corgi so suddenly? Was there an accident, a medical condition, something environmental? But the answers never came. And then another twist quietly surfaced months later. Reports began confirming that Muick, the surviving Corgi, was no longer living at Royal Lodge at all. He had been moved to Windsor Castle, where royal staff who had known the Queen and cared for her dogs for years took over his daily routine. The statement from insiders was simple but revealing. The staff knew the dog's habits, knew the schedule, and it was better this way. Better this way. Those 3 words spoke volumes. They suggested that the original arrangement celebrated so publicly after the Queen's death had not actually worked. Meanwhile, the Queen's other dogs, the ones quietly placed with trusted staff members rather than used in public announcements, thrived. One lived to the remarkable age of 18 under attentive care. Another remains healthy and happy years later. The contrast is impossible to ignore. The dogs entrusted quietly to people who knew the Queen's routines flourished, while the ones placed into the center of a royal public relations narrative faced disruption, tragedy, and relocation. And when you step back and look at the entire story, the uncomfortable possibility becomes clear. The Queen's beloved Corgis may have been used as symbols in a carefully managed effort to rehabilitate the image of a disgraced prince during one of the monarchy's most fragile transitions. One dog is gone under unexplained circumstances. Another had to be quietly removed from the situation. And the palace has never fully addressed any of it. The Queen built 70 years of loyalty around those animals. Yet, after her death, the institution she served for a lifetime treated them less like cherished companions and more like pieces on a chessboard. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all is this. The dogs themselves had no voice in any of it. They couldn't question the decisions. They couldn't reveal what happened inside that house. They simply depended on the humans around them to do the right thing. Whether those humans truly did remains a question the palace has never fully answered.